All right. Well, hello and welcome, friends, to the Minnesota Gardening Live. We're having a workshop today on jumping worms, and a lot of folks wanted to watch this today, so I was really excited to have this here for everybody. And so we've had a couple jumping worms workshops over the course of the year as jumping worms have become more in the media and more out there for people to know and see. But it has changed quite a bit since the last time we talked about jumping worms here in Minnesota. So let me share my screen here. So we've got a lot of things going on, a lot of things happening, and a lot of changes has happened over the course of the year in Minnesota, especially from where jumping worms are known now to be. So we're going to talk a lot about that today, and what are jumping worms, how to handle them, and take things from there. So with that, we'll roll right into it. If you have any questions on this, you can use the chat. So folks who come in can use the chat here to help answer any questions of things that I miss as well. You can email me or shoot me a text, whatever works easiest for you. So what is a jumping worm? So jumping worms are an invasive worm species from Asia. And actually, all earthworms in Minnesota are invasive. Well, not invasive. All earthworms are non-native to Minnesota. So there are a lot that have gotten used to living in Minnesota. And so that's they are helpful for soils and things like that, but they are not native to Minnesota, which I didn't know. And so this one is an invasive species, which means it takes over areas and it does negative things to our current existing native habitats here in Minnesota in the United States. So it is highly destructive in the native and landscape settings, and different than our earthworms that we're used to. They only live in the top couple inches of soil. And so they only live at the top of the soil in the mulch and in leaf matter and right there at the surface. And they do a lot of nasty things there for root zones and things like that, which we'll get into in a second. They were first documented in Minnesota back in 2006. So that was the first time that we really noticed them in Minnesota, and they started to get significantly more prevalent over the course of the last 5 years. So jumping worms move in a snake-like manner. It's very different than how you see earthworms moving. So here's a video of jumping worms in action here. So you see how they're moving differently than earthworms normally move that we see on a day-to-day basis here during the summer. But then when he touches it, they do this crazy curl and moving. And they do not like to be messed with, and they make sure that you know it. And that's part of how they get that jumping worm name. And so why jumping worms are really bad is because they reproduce heavily in the soil. And so they reduce your soil root zone where all your plants are at to the consistency of coffee grounds. And so they look a lot, that soil loses all of its soil structure. And part of what makes the Minnesota and the Midwest really good for growing plants is our topsoil. And so it's got a great mix, a loamy mix of clay, of sand, of organic material that really works well. And so those jumping worms, they go through and they eat all that organic material and they reduce that soil to pebbles and coffee grounds and that type of consistency. And what that does is a lot of plants are unable to hold their roots in the soil. They're unable to grab nutrients from the soil as they normally would be, and a lot of other negative things happening there as well. So it is really bad, especially in native areas also. I mean, it's obviously bad when they get into our gardens and that type of thing, but in native areas where they're first found, they were first noticed in Wisconsin and in the Wisconsin Arboretum, in fact. And so there, one of the researchers was walking down a slope and the entire slope just gave way because there was no soil structure to hold things in. And so, as you can imagine, if they get into our North Woods in Minnesota, they will, from there they will take and they can get into our native areas and into our woods, and they can reduce the soil structure so that all of our trees, if there's a heavy wind blow or things like that, trees don't have the root stability to hold themselves upright. So we just really need to watch this and take really good diligent steps to make sure that we aren't spreading this. And we'll talk through that today. So how to identify a jumping worm here. This is what it looks like up close, as well as the castings, which is what the soil looks like after all these jumping worms have their way with it. Looks like, again, coffee grounds, and you can very much see a difference there between what normal soil should look like. So jumping worms, they have a light colored ring that goes fully around the body, and it's called a clitellum is what that's called. And so it is a light colored ring that is different than normal earthworms that we're used to seeing here in Minnesota. And so they thrash violently, and they appear to jump when they're handled, so they can bounce around. And here's a video of that happening. So the slow-mo there of that one jumping out the top left is pretty crazy. So they just go a little nuts here, and jumping worms do exactly that. And so that's video from Wisconsin there. And so here is the difference between earthworms and jumping worms, the ones that we like and do well with us, and jumping worms. And so with that, the night crawlers or earthworms that we normally see have a raised clitellum, so that ring that goes around the earthworm. And jumping worms have a very smooth and a much lighter color clitellum there, and it's closer to the head. And so that number of rings that the earthworm has, from that ring to the ridges there to the end of the worm, is how they identify what your earthworms are. So if you find a worm, you want to know if it's an jumping worm or not. That is the way that they identify and decide whether it actually is a jumping worm or not. And so here are a couple pictures from our Minnesota Gardening Club member, Marilyn, of jumping worms. She unfortunately has jumping worms in her front yard, and these are a couple pictures she sent me of those jumping worms. So you can really see that clitellum that's really smooth and white. And this is one of the best pictures I've seen, really showing that, and those ridges that you have, which you are used to identify how close that clitellum is to the end of the worm. And so this is a really good picture. So we'll talk a little bit more about what to do if you find things or are concerned that you have jumping worms in just a little bit. So jumping worms have a very different life cycle than our earthworms. When our earthworms overwinter, they just go deep, deep, deep in the soil past the frost layer. And so they overwinter down there in hibernation. But with our, and so they last through the winter. Jumping worms, however, they do not live through a Minnesota winter. So they can't make it through a Minnesota winter. But they have egg sacs that do live through a Minnesota winter. And so this is a picture of those egg sacs. And so they are millimeters wide, so they're really, really tiny, and they're nearly impossible to find if you're not really looking for them. So if you have soil in a plant, you won't be able to see them there, and so they're really difficult. And so this is how they overwinter. And the jumping worms stay, again, in the top couple inches of the soil, and so once it freezes, they die off. But the egg sacs will make it through the winter. And so the worms die in winter, but the cocoons survive. They hatch in the spring when it becomes warm, and they won't be visible. So you won't see if you have any jumping worms until early summer. So June, July, that time frame is when people start to notice if they have jumping worms. They start to see different characteristics in the soil that they've got. And then they are highly visible come fall. And so they reproduce a lot. And so there are a lot of jumping worms that come around. And so it's a really important that you look out for those jumping worms as it gets into the summer. So how they spread, the number one way that we think that they came here to Minnesota is through fish bait. So there was a study that was done by, I believe it was the Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin. They ordered a lot of worms online for bait, and a significant portion of those bait worms that were delivered via the mail were included jumping worms in them. And so it's really easy to get those as bait. So you need to make sure, if you're a fisherman, fisher person, that you are only getting earthworms, and you watch out for jumping worms in your bait. And if you do have things, to make sure to dispose of them really well. So they also move around by mulch. This is the way they're moving through the metro. Generally is moved through mulch, compost, soil, as well as moved in plant material. So they can get, there are a couple instances from this summer where a landscape nursery garden center had some jumping worms and plant material that they had. And so people who purchased that plant material from a reputable source got that into their home gardens, as well as there are many instances where St. Paul specifically, where compost pile had some jumping worm eggs in them and spread out to different places as well through that. So this is where jumping worms are in the United States currently. And so you can see identified where they are currently in the United States. So you can see that this is a Minnesota, upper Midwest centric thing. There are a few places on the East Coast, in Indiana and Ohio. We'll zoom in on this just a little bit. So this is where jumping worms have been noticed. And we don't really know right now if it's just simply because other places don't have jumping worms, or if it's just because we've been doing outreach and media on jumping worms here in Minnesota. It's really inconclusive at this point as to what the data is, because this is such a new thing and people don't really know exactly what's going on with it yet. So here specifically in Minnesota, if you look on that on the left, that was August of 2020. So that was where they were first noticed. That's in August of 2020, where they had the counties in Minnesota that had been identified in. The March of 2021, you can see it expanded significantly to quite a few more counties throughout the metro and southeast Minnesota, and also adding another county in Wisconsin. But then here's where we're at today. So this is as of early November of 2021. And so you can see that jumping worms are more prevalent in southeast Minnesota, as well as the metro has completely filled in for all the counties in the metro have jumping worms identified there as well. And then it's making its way up the Mississippi Valley. So we assume that there are a lot more places in Minnesota that do have jumping worms as well. They just haven't been identified as yet. And so here's kind of a heat map as to where the most reported are. And so most areas have between 2 and 10 at least reported, but it's heavily concentrated in Hennepin and Ramsey County, as well as Dakota County has a lot of identifications, and Olmsted County and Rochester has a bunch as well. But again, we have to presume that these are much more widespread than we're currently seeing. So now that we know what to look for with jumping worms, what can people do? So the key to jumping worms, keeping them under control, is prevention and identification. So making sure that if you are looking for jumping worms, making sure to know what to look for when you buy new plant material, those types of things. Prevention is key for your plant material, and then identifying that early. So as you are looking through your landscape, you are looking for that ground coffee type soil, and you're looking for worms that are acting weird, and that we identify it early so that we're able to keep it contained wherever it is, and then stop the spread of these jumping worms. And so if you find out and know that you have jumping worms on your landscape, we'll talk about a couple mitigation strategies, but unfortunately there's not a lot that can be done. There's not a ton of ways where you can rid yourself of jumping worms in your landscape easily. And so from there, we just need to make sure it doesn't spread other places. So when you find it somewhere, make sure to keep it contained as well as you possibly can in that area where you find it. So in prevention, on that side of things, make sure to be purchasing from reputable sources for plants, mulch, and compost. You can't be 100% confident, but making sure that you are doing that as much as possible. And ask questions. Ask how a compost, where it came from, what it was, making sure that it was heated properly to kill those egg sacs off, because compost should be warm enough to kill pathogens and insect eggs and things like that, including jumping worms, if they are composting appropriately. So make sure to ask those kinds of questions. And then if you are doing plant swaps, if you are sharing plants with neighbors and things, if you have identified that you or your neighbors or anyone around you has jumping worms, just stop that practice and don't share things until we have better mitigation practices for this, if ever, on that line. But just make sure not to be sharing those around. And if you are getting plants from plant swaps, make sure to only, especially in the spring when those egg sacs are so small, make sure that you are only getting bare root plants. And so if you are getting something, let's say you've got a daylily or a hosta from a plant swap or from a neighbor or something like that, make sure that the person who you are getting it from rinses the soil off of that plant completely. So you want to dig that up. You want to rinse all the soil off at the place where it comes from. You don't want to do this at your house because it's not going to help at all. So you want to make sure that you are rinsing that off and that you are getting rid of all the soil, and then inspecting it closely to look for those egg sacs. You'll be able to see them once you get the soil off, but those egg sacs are small, and you want to look at them for small, round egg sacs and make sure you don't have anything like that on your plants, and then you are mostly safe to plant those from that point on. So jumping worms are pretty difficult to eradicate once an infestation has taken hold. So it's really difficult to get rid of them. It can be done, especially if you are able to catch them early. But the way you do that is something called vermifuge. And so it's a goofy word, but what it means is you take and mustard, ground mustard, is highly irritating to worms. And so it's really irritating to the skin of worms. And so you mix 1/3 of a cup of ground mustard with 1 gallon of water. And so 1/3 of a cup of ground mustard to 1 gallon of water. And then you pour it slowly onto the soil. And when you do that, you're able to get those worms will pull up, and they will come to the surface, and they will be exposed, and you'll be able to handpick those worms and kill them. So now you can only do this when the worms are active. So this is something that will be an activity that will take place in July, August, September, October. So that late summer, early fall time, before we get heavy freezing to kill off those jumping worms before the soil gets cold. But this is what it looks like, is pouring that mustard water, vermifuge, onto the soil. And then that brings those earthworms. It'll also bring the earthworms up. It'll bring the jumping worms up. All the worms that are in that area will come to the surface. So if you find it in a garden bed where they seem pretty concentrated, you are able to use this, and you can put it in a garden can, whatever is the easiest way for you. Spread that on the soil, and then wait 15 to 20 minutes, and those worms will come to the surface, and you'll be able to pick them off and kill them. And so you want to, it's funny how the websites say, from the university and things like that, say that when one is reported that it was a photo was taken and then it was euthanized, and euthanized seems like a very cute word to me to be using for worms, but just kill it. So you want to kill that worm, whether you step on it. Another appropriate, I think, less responsible way of doing it is to put those worms into a bag that's sealed, and then you put it in the garbage, and it will go to the landfill at that point. But just make sure they aren't able to get out. So the appropriate way is just to get rid of them as you can. So from there, what can people do? So starting this training is a really, really great way to understand what is going on with landscape, what's going on with jumping worms, and how they're being spread throughout the state of Minnesota, and what you as a gardening expert or even a gardening layperson can do to understand how to stop that spread and identify it if it's becoming a problem. So so thank you for being here for this as well. There is a training to become a U of M host site to search for worms. And so there are host sites where you can do that. And the number one thing is just to be vigilant in your garden, to make sure to check for worms consistently during that active growing cycle of those worms that you are looking for. You know what your soil is supposed to look like. You know where that's supposed to be, and you know what's happening there in your garden. So make sure to be checking for worms there and checking all new plants, soil, compost, and mulch for jumping worms as they come in. So that's a really big thing. So also ask questions of places where you are purchasing it from. So I'm expecting to get a big load of compost in the spring, and I always get my compost from a place down 169 here in Shakopee. And I will be asking them where that compost came from to make sure that it is somewhere that is a commercial compost site, to make sure that has gotten warm enough to kill off all the eggs, and to do my due diligence on that and making sure that we are not spreading more jumping worms around. So the U of M has a jumping worm project. And so you want to report. The U of M would like to know whether you have found jumping worms after you've looked through it, and if you have not found jumping worms as you're looking through your landscape. And so it looks like this. And so I had the website there. It's jwp.cfans.uofm.edu. And this is the Jumping Worms Project website that the U of M has. They have a lot of training on here. There's self-guided training. There's Zoom trainings as well that you can do there. And if you have data to submit, you click on this submit data, and it brings up a form that you are able to submit your jumping worms photos, see what you have, where your location is, and that kind of thing, to make sure to be submitting data to the Jumping Worm Project, so they're able to find out where things are and where things aren't throughout the state of Minnesota. This is a place where you can also find out if there are jumping worms that have been identified near you. So this is, I'll give links. I'll send out an email after this that has links to these, and as well in the packet that we'll send out. The people who are watching this on the replay would get this before. And so this is a link where you can look and see where things are. So this is a list of all of the identified confirmed reports of jumping worms throughout the nation. And you can see this, you can click on points here, and it will bring up where they're being located and how many of them are in areas. And so you can just kind of dive in and look and see where they're being brought up. So you can see that Hennepin County, Ramsey County, North Metro, as well as Dakota County has quite a few, and Olmsted County down here in Rochester has quite a few as well. So again, this is not conclusive whatsoever. This is simply where they have been currently identified. So this is a great website to know what is going on around everyone there. So with that, jwp.cfans.umn.edu. We'll take any questions that people have. We don't have many people on here live today, so I don't know if we're going to have many questions, but we'll go through a couple things that people have asked when we've had this in the past. And so if you have any questions, you can use the chat, or if you're watching this on replay, you can email me or text me, whatever works best for you. I will make sure that when you are watching the replay, you've got all of that contact information there. And so one big thing that people ask as we are going through this training with other folks is about soil, and should people stop purchasing things, and how should the what's the appropriate actions for people to be taking with this issue. And so I had talked to the DNR. So we had a podcast with Laura Van Riper of the Minnesota DNR. It's minnesotagardening.com/3 is where you can find that podcast. But she was just amazing. And so there are people who have jumping worms, major infestations in their landscapes, who are doing just fine. So all the things in their yard are doing okay. There are not big problems with jumping worms killing plants or anything like that. in the short term for the landscape. And so with that, they also say they don't know exactly how this will affect things long term. So as it are the jumping worms going to be invasive enough and get populations big enough, like it did in Wisconsin, in that native area, which was perfect for jumping worms to be able to live. But in our home suburban landscapes and that type of thing, in our home landscapes, will they reproduce enough in order to be able to loosen the soil enough to take down trees and that kind of thing? And it's too early for us to really know that. And so they're watching as trees fall down. They're working with tree companies to see as if trees fall down in storms, if there were jumping worms, and if that has anything to do with the death of those trees and that kind of thing. So they're working that way. But it's just really too soon to tell. There are some plants that they expect will be able to do just fine with living with jumping worms, and their roots are deep enough that it won't be a problem. But there are other more shallow rooted plants, like they've seen it mostly in hosta so far, that hostas are not doing well with jumping worms because they have a lot shallower roots and the top couple inches of soil, and they go there. So that's a big piece of that. And then so yeah, this question we often get. So Marilyn asks, does the mustard affect plants? And the answer to that is no. The mustard does not affect plants. And so the vermifuge, it does not have any sort of effect on the plant material, on any of the native plants. It doesn't have any detrimental effects whatsoever on plant material. So you can use that as you want. Even as it builds up in the soil, it's not a problem. It doesn't hurt anything. But it just irritates the skin of all worms. And so it will bring those up to the soil. And so you'll be able to see them. And next year, I intend to do that in my garden just to show how it works. And so we'll have video of how that works and take it from there. So that's good. Another question I get often is about what people should do, if they should just stop planting plants, if they should stop sharing plants with friends. One of the number one things I think people should do is absolutely, no matter if you have or don't have jumping worms, stop taking plants to northern Minnesota. So if you have a cabin, if you have something like that, don't take plants from the metro to northern Minnesota. It is a risk, especially in the spring. In the fall, you can probably do it because you'll know if you have jumping worms at that point. But in the spring, it's really impossible to be able to tell. And so as we are, a lot of folks will, cut some daylilies or some hostas and take those up to a cabin, and just simply stop that practice for now until we get a better handle on exactly what's happening with jumping worms. And so it's really important that people know that, and that you are being really diligent about not sharing this through other areas. And so it's a good thing there. So with that, I will take any other questions that people have over the course of this. So if you're watching this on the replay, again, you can get in touch with me. You'll in your email on the replay, you will be able to email me. Thanks for being here, Marilyn. It's great seeing you. You'll be able to email, and you'll be able to make phone calls, and whatever works best for you, you can join and be there with us at that point. So I just really appreciate you being here today, and best of luck with jumping worms, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.